In this video, I'm going to be making the grossest possible dungeon I can think of. Every month on my Patreon, I create a new tabletop role-playing game adventure zine, and I like to give myself a new challenge each month. So for example, the Shadespire Mountains, I wanted to design a point crawl adventure, and for the Plumwax Kobolds, I wanted to design a completely chaotic, randomized dungeon. And for December, this month, I wanted to do a linear gauntlet style dungeon, like a straight path through the dungeon, but lots of crazy obstacles to see if your players can overcome them. And with that design challenge in mind, I then like to layer a theme on top of it. So the Shadespire Mountains, I wanted to do a flip on the orcs versus elves idea. And Plumwax Kobolds, I just wanted to do a bunch of crazy kobold traps and shenanigans. And for this month's theme, I just wanted to draw something gross. So slime and guts and creepy crawly stuff. Nothing says Christmas time like gross creepy crawlies. What? I don't know, dude. And somehow through all of that, I came up with Flick Silverpin's Guide to the Emperor of Worms. So right now I am drawing this dungeon in Photoshop. This is gonna be the first page of the zine and the map that the dungeon master can use to sort of visualize how this dungeon works. So I was thinking about making a dungeon all about giant insects because that's creepy and gross. You know, what does an interaction with a giant mosquito that just wants to suck blood look like? Or what about roly-poly that just wants to eat metal? And what about a giant colossal worm that just wants to eat people? And somehow that got me thinking about middle school. And you know, when in middle school, like biology class, you dissect an earthworm, and it's like so gross, and I can still smell that horrible smell. And that kind of just seems like something that would be super fun to draw and create this dungeon. And then I had the idea of a sort of linear gauntlet style dungeon, and it just all came together. The players get eaten by this giant worm, and there's a bunch of challenges that they have to face to escape this worm. And the only way to escape it is to go through it. And that is gonna be gross. I guess you could think of it as like a Dungeons and Dragons, like what are those Ninja Warrior obstacle course through a giant worm that is filled with a bunch of humanoid insects. So I don't want to give away the whole story of the adventure, but as you can imagine, a giant worm dungeon, each body part, each like organ is its own set of challenges for the players, and they have to make their way through. So it starts with them getting swallowed by this emperor of worms. So the players start in the mouth, and then there's the brain and the esophagus, and there's a thing called the crop and the gizzard, and then it leads into the intestines, which makes up most of the worm. So that's like gonna be a bunch of random encounters. And I'm just having fun drawing this crazy dungeon. And I think if you're not too grossed out by it, it will be a lot of fun. So if you actually want to get this zine and run it, or be inspired by it, or look at a bunch of gross insect drawings, definitely go check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. Like I said, every month I create a new tabletop role-playing game adventure zine. And even if it's not something you want to run personally, I try and pack as much inspiring stuff into these zines as possible. So maps and weird ideas, magic items, and monsters that you can pull out for your own game. I'm just really proud of all the work that goes into these little books every month, and it'd be cool if you checked it out. But maybe you're not watching this video to hear all about my Patreon. You're watching to get inspired about creating your own dungeons. And I think what I've learned from this process of making new dungeons and adventures every month is a helpful process to go from having an idea to actually a playable thing that you can run for your players. Playable players, whatever. You get it. So the first thing I do is think about what kind of adventure I want to run for my players, and also what they would be interested in playing. You know, whether that's the more traditional 5-room style dungeon or more linear one like the Emperor of Worms, or a hex crawl kind of thing, or maybe just creating a huge mega dungeon. Having your dungeon or adventure format, let's call it, in mind will help you determine how many monsters and traps and items and stuff you need to fill up this dungeon. Then you can move on to the fun part, which is theming it. I always like to think about what is going to impress or surprise my players, what's gonna make them have the most fun. And then I also sort of think when I'm having the most fun dungeon mastering, it kind of carries over and they have more fun playing. So in the case of the Emperor of Worms, you know, I wanted to roleplay a bunch of giant insects and describe a bunch of gross insect bodily functions, you know, gastric fluids, bubbling and popping and pulsating flesh and muscles, gross slime. Blech. This stuff's gross, but it's super fun to gross out your players, you know? So you have what type of dungeon or adventure you're trying to build, you have a theme, and then you start layering stuff together. And I think when you have the framework or the format of your dungeon, that gives you some restrictions or some guidelines that you know you have to follow. And then when you layer the theme on top of it, that allows your imagination to start going crazy within the restrictions of this format. And that's when you start coming up with all these crazy ideas. So for the Emperor of Worms, it's like, what happens when the players get eaten by this giant worm and they have to find their way out? I know that it's going to be this linear gauntlet style dungeon. So how do I fill up this worm with a bunch of challenges for them? I know I have to describe the place, so I list out a bunch of gross stuff to describe what's going on inside this worm, what lives inside of the worm. You know, I get to fill it up with a bunch of monsters and NPCs. And then another super important thing is what sort of conflict is going on inside of this dungeon, regardless of the players being there or not. That's the kind of stuff that makes this place feel believable. And coming up with good conflicts among the monsters and NPCs and the place that they're in allows the players to sort of bump into all of these things and see how their actions either help or hurt or contribute to this conflict. And that's the really fun part about playing tabletop role-playing games. So that's just a little bit of advice for creating some dungeons or adventures. You can apply it to either, you know, whether it's an underground dungeon or an area in the world. Doesn't really make a difference. The advice still applies. And this is my weird, gross, disgusting dungeon for this month, December 2021 Patreon adventure. If you're still here at the end of the video, I super appreciate you sticking with me, especially through my congested talking here. I guess it's sort of fitting that I'm describing a disgusting, gross, slimy, snotty dungeon and I'm all stuffed up. But regardless, I hope this was helpful and inspiring, or at least a little bit interesting. I hope you check out the Patreon. I'm really proud of all of the work that goes into these monthly zines. And yeah, that's it for the Emperor of Worms. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!